Live Rats, or The Art of Poverty. When talking to a group of young artists, it's always tricky to know exactly what to say. But today, I'm going to talk to you about rats. I expect that this is not the usual thing for someone who has come to talk to you about art. But I'm going to propose to you an idea of rats that will give you an idea of art that you may not get in any other way. It will turn out that this idea is quite a stubborn one that has been around for a long time. Or, another way to put this is that it's an idea that might not have developed in history. Instead, it might just keep coming back the same, which might be the nature of a rat, and might mark out its difference from what we normally think about art, which, unlike a rat, does seem to change. So, I'm going to make an argument that might repeat itself a few times today. In fact, it's going to be an incredibly repetitive story about rats right into our present. Let me start with a little epigraph from Lev Tolstoy, who was one of the great thinkers both of poverty and of art. He says, "Free the slaves of capital, and it will be impossible to produce such refined art." So, what am I going to talk about? And what will this lecture cover that's not just rats? Well, mostly I want to talk to you about some political art. And by political art, sometimes I mean artworks that make a political claim. But also sometimes I mean political movements that create artworks. And sometimes I mean artworks which are kind of already on the way to becoming politics. These works might even have to give up their claim to be art in order to become political. And in particular, I'm interested in talking about artworks and theories of art that deal in poverty. More precisely, I want to talk about how art might use impoverishment as a method, or as a strategy, or as a tactic, or as a way of thinking and making. Now, I'm going to set out something like an argument here, and this argument will return. Well, maybe it's not quite an argument, but more like a structure or a motif, but I want you to try to keep it in mind. So I want to talk to you about some works and some thoughts that use poverty or impoverishment in a specific way and for a specific purpose. Often in the works I'll discuss, there will be a reference to or a comparison with or a portrait of rich art. And almost always there will be an accusation that will be the same, that rich art preserves the division between art and life. Or at least that rich art finds itself profoundly separated from the lives of most people. In fact, what rich art might do is to create forms that are all about separating themselves from the real poverty of life. So the arts of poverty that I'm going to discuss arrive with a single purpose, that is, to overcome this division of art and life. The main thrust of the works that I want to talk about is the idea that if we can impoverish art enough, then maybe we can make an art out of life. Or, to put that the other way around, maybe for the first time, real life, in all of its poverty, could be understood as art. Now, in order to give you this idea, I'll talk a little about history, although this might not be history in the normal sense. But I'm going to talk about a bunch of old people, and mainly they're dead. I want to say at the outset that they have no authority here. I'm not interested in them because they're old, or because they said some things. And I don't want you to go away from this lecture with the idea that I've given you their names because I want you to respect them. I'm going to make an argument for impoverishment. So if they're not useful, we can throw them out, impoverish ourselves by doing without them. So what are my starting points? Well, I want to offer you a sort of unsentimental view of poverty and impoverishment. Poverty, of course, is a real condition in the world for most people, The world, or at least those parts of it that are produced, fabricated or constructed, is mainly made by poor people. And the poor people continue to make and remake the world every day, yet the world continues to impoverish most people in it. I'm also concerned to give you something like a global perspective that comes out of this thought about rats, impoverishment and art. That's to say that when we get thinking about what an impoverished art might be, it's going to lead us out of the gallery, into the streets. It's going to lead us out of Europe and America. And it's going to lead into some kind of broader view of the world. So I should offer you some background about me. I'll tell you a little about my own research. Right now, I'm writing a lot about inflation. And one of the things that means is that I ask a lot of really wonky questions about what happens when money isn't worth anything anymore. One of my questions is, what are the opposites of value? That's a strange sort of question with lots of answers. Sometimes the opposite of value is junk, and sometimes it's freedom, and sometimes it's nothing, and sometimes it's things that are useless, and sometimes it's action or violence, and sometimes it's punk. Sometimes it's things that have been devalued, or which are out of fashion, or are broken. I want you to appreciate that this in itself is a sort of inflationary question that seems to churn out answers, as though they were an ever-expanding stack of banknotes, all of which have no value at all. So, I live a lot of my life thinking with and in this strange realm of possible answers to this question. I live a lot with God and shit at the same time. I live a lot with waste and art. But today, when I talk to you about impoverishment, I want to note a relation to this question. That is, there are many ways that things can be impoverished, and it's not just about money not being there. We can have moral impoverishment, and we can have impoverishment of thought. Speech and language can be made impoverished, and in fact all the ways we communicate can become impoverished in some way. Who would use a complicated word when you can use a simple one? Who would use a simple word when you can grunt? Who would grunt when you could punch someone? And now the radical question, what does the punch say that the grunt doesn't? What does the grunt say that the word doesn't? I think having a means to take away the richness of language is going to be an important question for us. And along with communication, well, life can be impoverished, and the spirit of life can be impoverished when cultural values are devalued. But so too can the conditions of life. We might eat bad food, or live in bad houses, or work for bad wages. I want to make you aware that in the arts of impoverishment, these different answers might become different strategies for an artist. Well, with that introduction done, we can get back to the rat. I'd like to start by talking about a poem called A Toy for the Poor by a guy called Baudelaire, which is from a collection called Paris Spleen. Here's what Baudelaire wrote. I'd like to introduce an innocent diversion. There are so few amusements not wicked. Going for a morning stroll to take in the sights along a main street, fill your pockets with cheap little gimmicks, such as cardboard puppets on a thread, little blacksmith figures beating anvils, horsemen on horses with a whistle for tail. And along by the taverns, under the trees, offer them gratis to whatever poor and unknown children you come by. You will see their eyes widen. At first they won't dare accept such good fortune not quite believable. Then they will grab the gift and move away, as cats distance themselves to eat what you toss them, having learned to distrust mankind. On a drive inside the gate of a large garden, where sunlight reveals a lovely white manor, stood a neat and beautiful little boy in fastidious country garments. Luxury, freedom from care, habitual wealthy surroundings give children good looks like this, until one could suppose them made of a different substance from the offspring of the middle class or of the poor. Beside him, on the grass, lay a splendid toy, a figure neat as its master, polished, gilded, in a purple robe covered with plumes and trinkets. But he paid no attention to this favoured toy, for here is what he was actually looking at. Outside the gate, across the road, between thistle and nettle, was another boy, dirty, sickly, soot-covered, one of those outcast urchins whose beauty an impartial eye might appreciate if, as connoisseurs can spot a transcendent painting veneered over with later varnish, it could wash off the repulsive patina of poverty. Across the symbolic bars separating two worlds, big street and big house, the poor boy displayed his own toy to the rich, who stared greedily, as if at an object rare and unknown. For the toy that this gutter snipe poked at, shook, waved about in a cage, was a live rat. His parents, for economy no doubt, had provided him a toy from life itself, and the two children, each to the other, laughed fraternally, with teeth of equal whiteness. So, who was Baudelaire, this guy who wrote this poem? Well, let me give you a coarse, impoverished portrait of him. He was probably the most important poet in France in the 19th century. His dad died when he was a kid, and he inherited a bunch of money when he was 21, which he mainly spent really quickly. He was a great lover of beautiful things, and as well as poetry, he wrote quite a lot of criticism and essays. But he wasn't really in any way a professional. He was a dropout and a bohemian. He spent a lot of his life drunk. In his lifetime, his poetry was quite poorly regarded, and he did not live well from it. In fact, he spent most of his life in debt and financial hardship. Now, you'll notice something immediately about the form of this poetry, that it isn't in verse, and Baudelaire was a great pioneer of poetry like this. We might think of that too as a type of impoverishment, that poetry has impoverished itself of its verse, its rhyme and its metre, and that it has taken up language from elsewhere, from the street, from newspapers, from conversations, from novels, all of which were cheaper than a poem in verse. Now, I want to give you a reading of this rat poem, and it's not going to be a complicated reading, and I can assure you that complicated readings really are possible here. We have a poem with a dense and complex architecture, with the mirroring of cages and gates, but let's do without all that wealth. I want to say one thing, which is that this poem is an allegory. Well, what's an allegory? It's like a big extended metaphor, and most allegories have some kind of hidden political or moral meaning. So, what's this poem an allegory for? I'm going to say this is an allegory about art. And Baudelaire tells us this much in another essay which contains the same story of the live rat. There he says, the toy is the child's first initiation into art. So, allow me to continue this crude allegorical reading. This is a poem about art. The rich child in the fine clothes by the big house is every rich person you ever met. In fact, it's every rich person who ever lived, every aristocrat, every factory owner, every banker and every boss. It is the entire classes of the rich. The highly decorated doll with its purple robes, its polish, its gold, its plumes and its trinkets. This is the entire history of art. It's all the art the rich ever had. And quite rightly, it's been left on the ground to be ignored. The live rat, and this is the crucial point, the live rat is a new type of art. It's an art that, for economic reasons, has been drawn from life itself. It's an art of the street. It's freed from the big house, and, you might think also from the gallery. It's a poor art. It's an art that's full of life and action, so full of life that even the rich desire it. Maybe it's not beautiful, this live rat, but it does change everything, and that's what's important. This live rat announces a new order. Before the live rat, when they see it, both the rich and the poor are suddenly equal. So it's a sort of political rat too, but they're equal in a specific way, in laughter. Now, in this lecture, I'm going to make a defence of live rats against rich art in the style of Baudelaire. And I want you to see that what is announced in this poem is a really stubborn idea. The idea that something drawn from life, maybe something kind of disgusting even, something not so beautiful, something impoverished, something can break down some boundaries. And so the rat is a sort of proposition about art. It's a proposition about all of the art of the rich and its irrelevance, and it's a proposition about what an impoverished art might do. I have a feeling that Baudelaire thought of his own poems as live rats, that this was a sort of artistic ideal, and that as an artist he couldn't help but endlessly try to impoverish his own art, and that he wanted to make these poems as cheap toys to give to the poor for free, to hope that he would get in return his own share of poverty. If I want anything from this lecture, I want you to be able to go to certain types of artworks and say, I know that. It's that live rat, because I'm going to tell you that there are rats everywhere. And learning to appreciate a rat is a pretty important thing. Learning how to try to make a rat is also quite important. But that's what I really want, is for you to be able to identify your rats. Maybe the rats are obvious. Maybe you already know them. Now, I want you to keep in mind something I just said, that one of Baudelaire's ideas was perhaps that if he gave away his poems for free like cheap toys, that he would get in return a share of poverty. I'm going to jump forward in history quite quickly and talk about a text by a thinker called Walter Benjamin from about 60 years later, and his text is titled Experience and Poverty. Now, Benjamin was a communist thinker, a political radical, a philosopher, a writer, a literary theorist and a critic, and he's writing in 1933, immediately after Hitler's seizure of power. He leaves Germany for good in the autumn of that year, and he goes and hangs out with his mate Bertolt Brecht, who's a poet and a playwright, who's living in Denmark. And he writes this down. He says, "The poet Bert Brecht declares that communism is the just distribution of poverty, not of wealth." I have a sense that the idea of Brecht's that Benjamin writes down is just what Baudelaire had in mind, even if Baudelaire wasn't quite a communist. Now, this text by Benjamin, Experience and Poverty, it's important to me because he gives a really very full account of different types of impoverishment. I've pulled out this quote which I'll read to you about his generation. Benjamin was born in the 1890s, and, as I say, he was writing this in 1933. And this is what he says. "This much is clear. Experience has fallen in value. Amid a generation which, from 1914 to 1918, had to experience some of the most monstrous events in the history of the world." That's the First World War. Perhaps this is less remarkable than it appears. Wasn't it noticed at the time how many people returned from the front in silence, not richer but poorer in communicable experience? And what poured out in the flood of war books 10 years later was anything but the experience that passes from mouth to ear. No, there was nothing remarkable about that, for never has experience been contradicted more thoroughly. Strategic experience has been contravened by positional warfare, economic experience by the inflation, physical experience by hunger, moral experiences by the ruling powers. A generation that had gone to school in horse-drawn streetcars now stood in the open air, amid a landscape in which nothing was the same except the clouds, and, at its centre, in a force field of destructive torrents and explosions, the tiny, fragile human body. Now, I'm going to just offer a tiny diversion before I talk about this text, As I mentioned, I'm working on inflation, and I kind of wanted to talk a little about one work of art that appears after the First World War during the inflation that Benjamin mentions here. As some of you will know, there was a major economic crisis in Germany, related to the bonds that they had used to fund the failed war effort. This quickly led to the devaluation of the currency. Well, I guess it's a little more complicated than that, because Germany also had to pay war reparations to all the other countries. And devaluation of the currency in fact became government policy in an attempt to pay off their debts by effectively printing money, so that both debt and currency get devalued. Now, the money devalued more quickly than the central bank could print it and get it to people. So the state says to all of the towns and all of the villages, you go and print your own money. And so this is a Germany in which currency, the bills and the coins, things which used to indicate wealth, now indicate quite the opposite. Your money starts to indicate your poverty. And so I wanted to stop on this image. I think that it's probably the only banknote in the history of money to depict someone taking a shit. Someone literally shitting out the number on the banknote. When your money is really worth nothing, this is the kind of really crude, good political art that you might find. And it's art that was made for a purpose, right? So when you are buying your bread with this, you might get a laugh out of it. You might not get as much bread as you used to get, but you might have a laugh, a sort of gallows humour that will be important to us. Hablik, the artist who designed this banknote, was an interesting utopian artist. But that's a story for another time. He spent a lot of his life trying to invent utopian crystal cities. But then the inflation happens and he gets drafted into making banknotes. So, let's return to Benjamin's argument. He does this extraordinary thing in this work, Experience and Poverty. He argues for a new, positive concept of barbarism. And I think Benjamin is also a really good thinker of the live rat, because the sort of argument he might make for a new barbarism is exactly the same sort of argument that we find in the Baudelaire poem. He starts by examining the contrast between the old experience and the new experience. The experience of the world in which he grew up, in which values still held their value, and which was quickly dying out as a result of the war and from the economic crisis, and was almost entirely gone in the impoverished world in which he found himself in 1933. And so he draws out this contrast in what the essay describes. On the one hand, you have 19th century interiors, which are stuffy. Think about Victorian wallpaper. Against this, he talks about glass architecture. The 19th century interior is a world seemingly composed of furnishings on which things can get caught or on which things rest and gather dust. The glass architecture is an impoverished architecture, not only because it has new types of surfaces that don't have any ornamentation, but because you can't even attach your possessions to it anymore. It signals at once the end of privacy and perhaps also the end of private ownership, if we read it in a utopian way. In the old world, there was culture. Maybe culture has been overcome and is going to be replaced by artificial language. And then there's experience that he talks about so much. Experience has two main meanings. So, experience is sometimes like, well, when I look out into the world, what do I see? What's it like? What's my experience of the world? But also experience is like, well, let's say I have a whole lot of experience in crisis management, and I'm going to pass on my experience in crisis management to you. Or if I need to know how to give a lecture, I might ask someone who knows a lot about giving lectures, and they might hand me their experience. And so there's this version of experience which is rather more like tradition. It's something which is passed on from one person to the next. And Benjamin says, in this new world, all of these modes of handing things on are broken. The transmission is interrupted. But also, your experience of the world, as you look at it, is impoverished too. Against the old world of ornamentation, Benjamin makes a defence of Cubism and Bauhaus. And against the old, lofty idea of humanity, he has a vision of humanity that is brutal and naked, a humanity which is brutalised and is surrounded by destruction. Now, as I say, Benjamin promotes in this text, quite unusually, a new positive concept of barbarism. And this scares me. It should probably scare you too, if I'm honest. Normally, most people, when they see a barbaric world, they say, well, what we need is a return to old values, or at least we need some new high values. The world is shit and we need to make it better. That kind of thing. They say, we need to reinstate culture, bring back civilization. But Benjamin says, no, you live in a world in which all of your values are devalued, and what you need to do is embrace devaluation. You have to make things poor. So, what are the conditions for this? And what are the dangers? For me, the danger is something like fascism. And that's really very serious. People who say, I want to live in a world of new barbarism, well, that's normally quite a bad sign. But for Benjamin, the conditions of that barbarism are already happening. That the economic crisis has already happened, the war has already happened, and the world is moving in this way. So for Benjamin, the demand for a new barbarism is a strategic position, and it's a position very closely related to the situation of war. Now, despite all of these questions of war and economic crisis, Benjamin ends his essay with a discussion of Mickey Mouse, who I like to think of as a sort of hero of the Wall Street crash. Well, Mickey Mouse turns up in 1928 and the Wall Street crashes a year later. But in this era of devaluation, suddenly you get animated mice on screen, and in fact animated mice become the most important thing that can be on a screen. And I'm going to read you really quickly what he says about Mickey Mouse, because Mickey turns out to be, strangely, an example of the good barbarian for these new times. Benjamin says this: the existence of Mickey Mouse is such a dream for contemporary man. His life is full of miracles, miracles that not only surpass the wonders of technology, but make fun of them. For the most extraordinary thing about them is that they all appear, quite without any machinery, to have been improvised out of the body of Mickey Mouse, out of his supporters and persecutors, and out of the most ordinary pieces of furniture, as well as from trees, clouds, and the sea. Nature and technology, primitiveness and comfort have completely merged. So here is your live mouse. It's not quite a live rat. It might not even quite be alive, but it's got something like a living body, or at least an animate or animated one. And it works with normal things, things drawn from everyday life, and it does something miraculous with them. Benjamin was an incredibly careful reader of Baudelaire, and I suspect that he was thinking of the rat when he makes this defence of Mickey Mouse in times of barbarism. Now, I want to talk to you about this question of laughter that I brought up with the banknote. Why are we talking about laughter? Why Mickey Mouse? Why are the kids in Baudelaire's poem laughing at this rat? What's that about? What is this laughter? Benjamin speaks about laughter too, at the very end of his essay. This is what he says: the economic crisis is at the door, and behind it is the shadow of the approaching war. So it's 1933. The fascists have taken charge in Germany, and even then he can see the Second World War is coming, even though it's 6 years away. He says, holding on to things has become the monopoly of a few powerful people who, God knows, are no more human than the many. For the most part, they are more barbaric, but not in a good way. Everyone else has to adapt, beginning anew with few resources. They rely on the men who have adopted the cause of the absolutely new and have founded it on insight and renunciation. In its buildings, pictures and stories, mankind is preparing to outlive culture, if need be. And the main thing is that it does so with a laugh. This laughter may occasionally sound barbaric. Well and good. So, one of the arguments I want to make is that the rat is a really good opposite of value because it's funny and because it provokes laughter. In fact, laughter may be a really good opposite of value too. It's not enduring, you can't buy things with it, but it might set up a new relation with other people. And, well, laughter is an incredibly poor thing. It's such a poor thing that it doesn't even have words in it. It's an expression that everyone knows. Even people who have all of the words are forced in laughter to have none again, while those who already had none when they laugh are left with nothing too. So there we are, the 1930s, but I want to jump forward and talk briefly now about art from the 1960s, and about Arte Povera, about poor art, which was an artistic movement, and this is yet another argument for rats. So, in northern Italy in the 1960s, you get this movement that occurs in the arts, and it's given this name by a curator called Germano Celant. In 1967, he publishes a text called Arte Povera, that's the poor art, Notes on a Guerilla War. Let me give you another crude portrait, now of the 60s in Italy. It's a time of enormous economic changes, and in the north, there is a boom led by car manufacture. Those northern cities form a hugely productive society, and mainly productive on American money. But in the south there's a lot of rural poverty, and in these years we see a large migration of workers from the south to the north, who become workers in the car plants. Unsurprisingly, they do not get particularly rich from this. And in the 60s in the Mediterranean as a whole, it's politically a very tense time. If I think about southern Europe then, well, Portugal has been fascist since the 1920s, Spain has been fascist since 1939, and in Greece, in 1967, a right-wing military dictatorship has just taken power. In Italy it looks like there might be attempts to take over the country, either from the left or from the right. Things are ready to explode. And then there's American money. So, like many, Celant was furious about what happens in this world of high industrial production in those cities where car manufacture was taking place. He makes this argument about what it does to culture. He talks about what happens to artists under these conditions. And you will recognise some motifs in what he says. He says, the artist, the new apprentice jester, is thus called upon to produce fine commercial merchandise, offering satisfaction to sophisticated palates. Once he has an idea, he has to live for it and on it. Mass production mentality forces him to produce a single object that satisfies the market to the point of saturation. He's not allowed to simply create an object and then abandon it to its destiny. He has to follow up on it, justify it, introduce it into the channels of distribution, turning himself as artist into a substitute for an assembly line. No longer a stimulator, technician, or specialist in discovery, he becomes a cog in a mechanism. So this is what your radical Italian artists are thinking. Artists under high capitalism become subservient to the rich, and they become just like every other factory worker, and they hate this. And so they announce a guerrilla war. They say, we're going to be artists in a different way. And so this is the proposal they make, not just to be artists making consumer goods for the wealthy with their sophisticated palates. They say, a new attitude for taking repossession of a real dominion over our own existence leads the artist towards continual forays outside of the places assigned to him, eradicating the cliché that society has stamped on his wrist. No longer among the ranks of the exploited, the artist becomes a guerrilla fighter, capable of choosing his places of battle, and with the advantages conferred by mobility, surprising and striking, rather than the other way around. And here, Chaland sets out the opposition of the rich art and the poor art in full. He says, so on the one hand, we have the attitude to be defined as rich, since it's osmotically connected to the enormous instrumental and informational possibilities that the system offers, an attitude that imitates and mediates the real and creates the dichotomy between art and life, public behaviour and private life. Right, so this is a terrible industrial machine to which the artist becomes a servant and a part. And here Chaland is clear that its end is to separate art and life. And he continues, on the other hand, we have poor research. So here's our argument for poverty. We have poor research intent on the identification of the individual in his actions, of the individual in his behaviour, thus eliminating all separations between the two levels of existence. We might have questions about whether Arte Povera, this new poor art, actually works, whether it actually does bridge art and life. I'll just pull up some examples from immediately around the time of this text. The Italian here in neon on this work by Mario Merz says, "What is to be done?" which is the name of a book by Lenin. And so this was explicitly political art, but it's art conducted with incredibly pared down means. Its forms are incredibly simple, indeed simplified. Now, I mainly wanted to speak to you today about one sculpture, which is this strange beast. I don't know if you have ever seen this sculpture before. It's called Untitled, Sculpture That Eats. And it's from 1968 by an artist called Giovanni Anselmo, who died really recently at the end of last year. I want to make a really brief reading of this work. Now, let me explain quickly what you're seeing here, how the sculpture is composed. There's a block of granite, it's got a metal wire, and it's got another block of granite. And you have to feed it lettuces. You put a lettuce in between the two blocks of granite, and then, if and when the lettuce wilts and dries out, the entire structure falls apart. And so you have to keep feeding it lettuces to maintain its integrity. This was the work. It's a sculpture that you have to constantly feed. And it's a very simple structure, and a very demanding one. It's made of pretty impoverished material, just 2 blocks of stone and a wire. This is what Chaland says, and I should say this is from 1967, before Anselmo makes this sculpture, but it's very relevant to this sculpture too. Chaland says, "The poverty of Giovanni Anselmo's action is more subtle. Precariousness is what calls itself to attention here. His objects live within the moment in which they are composed and assembled and have no existence as immutable objects. To re-exist, they have to be recomposed, which means that their existence depends on our interventions and behaviour. Rather than autonomous products, they are unstable and alive in relationship with our own lives." Now, I only really want to say one thing about this sculpture. It might not look like it, but this is a rat. This is just the same live rat that I've mentioned to you over and over again. It might be the oldest rat that ever existed, so old that its jaws are made of stone. It might be so primitive that it can't even digest. It might be a rat that eats lettuces, which is kind of strange because rats mainly don't eat lettuces. But I guess they sometimes do, if that's all that's left. It might be a rat that's so decrepit, so broken, and made of such poor materials that its head keeps falling off. This is a rat that's so incapable that it can't even find its own food. It demands food from us. But the thing that this sculpture is doing is the same gesture as the live rat. It's exactly the same gesture. It has the hope that it, as a poor art, can reconcile art and life. So this is really proper poor art, and it's just another rat. And I have one sense that one of the things that Anselmo wanted us to see was that this is what it is, like the rest of us, just a rat. Now, before I move on from the 1960s, I wanted to pick up on this question of guerrilla warfare, and I want you to remember what I said when I spoke about Benjamin, and how his call for the new barbarism is also close to this thought of war. So, in the 1960s, there was quite a lot of guerrilla warfare going on. There was the Vietnam War, and there was, in Latin America, a lot of struggles. And also across Africa, there were various decolonial struggles in which guerrilla warfare was used. Now, if you read the history of Arte Povera, you will see that in all of the fancy art histories, there's lots of historians and theorists, and they say, well, the artists, they made this claim about engaging in a guerrilla war. But then a real guerrilla war kind of happened. And then in Italy in the 1970s, there was an armed struggle, and the artists just weren't that serious about being guerrillas. Part of this is that the art world is trying to insulate itself from social conflict and from war. And in fact, you will see in this period artists who do go on to become urban guerrillas in Europe are no longer treated as artists. So, Italy in the 1970s was a pretty violent place. There was a lot of bombing, a sort of quiet civil war, and a lot of these struggles happen around the car manufacturing plants. Ultimately, the far left assassinates the Prime Minister in 1978, and then the state responds. It locks up 12,000 leftists, radicals, artists, writers, philosophers, and so the art historians who say Arte Povera wasn't so serious about action, well, they say that this was just a piece of rhetoric, but I'm not quite sure that gives the right account of what's going on here. My sense really is that anyone who says guerrilla warfare in 1967 knows what they're doing. And I want to point you to a pamphlet to illustrate this from the archive in which I worked for a few years. This is the Manual of the Urban Guerrilla, and it was a text written by a guy called Carlos Marighella, who was a Brazilian guerrilla fighter. And he writes this text in 1969. And what you're seeing on the screen here is a pirate edition in English, published here in the UK from 1970. In half a year, this was published halfway around the world. So I want to say that if you get into this rat stuff, if you get into this impoverished art, you're constructing a world in a different way, and you cannot help but make these global connections. Perhaps these artists didn't take up arms. Maybe they made things with blocks of granite instead of bombs. But the indication is that they were part of something. And that something, if you take up the art of poverty, is going to be an underground. And it's not going to just be in galleries anymore. Now, Arte Povera maybe did remain in galleries, so maybe it failed. But it was part of a culture that was doing something bigger. I can illustrate this maybe more with a discussion of yet another poem, which is another rat poem, even if it doesn't talk about rats. It's another poem of the poor, and it was written around the same time as this art was made in Italy. It comes from a poet from Guatemala. I'll simply read it. One day, the apolitical intellectuals of my country will be interrogated by the simplest of our people. They will be asked what they did when their nation died out, slowly, like a sweet fire, small and alone. No one will ask them about their dress, about their long siestas after lunch. No one will want to know about their sterile combats with the idea of the nothing. No one will care about their higher financial learning. They won't be questioned on Greek mythology or regarding their self-disgust when someone within them begins to die the coward's death. They'll be asked nothing about the absurd justifications, born in the shadow of the total lie. On that day, the simple men will come, those who had no place in the books and poems of the apolitical intellectuals, but daily delivered their bread and milk, their tortillas and eggs, those who drove their cars, who cared for their dogs and gardens, and worked for them, and they'll ask, "What did you do when the poor suffered, when tenderness and life burned out in them?" Apolitical intellectuals of my sweet country, you will not be able to answer. A vulture of silence will eat your gut. Your own misery will pick at your soul, and you will be mute in your shame. This is an extraordinary, impoverished poem. It's a poem written with impoverished means that uses the voice of the poor and the simplest of questions to undo all rich, elevated thinking. It's a poem that ridicules all pre-established values. Yep, it's another live rat. Now, Castillo, the poet, he was killed. He was part of a guerrilla unit fighting in Guatemala. And the army who were backed by the CIA attacked his unit. They captured him and tortured him, and they burned him to death. That's part of what was happening in these times, and that was one of the reasons people were writing poems like this in the global struggle. If you read poetry from these times, you will often find this quite brutal gesture of poverty, and you will find it all over the world. And you will also find that these rap poems travel globally too. I found this poem in an archive. It's the same poem. It appeared in a newspaper printed in Manchester, here in the UK, in 1970. So 5 years after it was written, and about 3 years after Castillo was killed. It's in the first edition of a radical newspaper for the Black and Afro-Caribbean community. And so it's circulating. This is part of its public. And so this is what I want to suggest, is that we're not talking about art that's going to stay in galleries, but it's going to circulate in small underground presses, in newspapers, in social movements, among different people. It might circulate on the street, which is something rats have been doing for as long ago as at least Baudelaire's poem. That's what impoverished art can do. But here we have this same poem about Guatemala set next to a description of poverty in Manchester in 1970 and a description of racism in Manchester in 1970. And so I take it really seriously that an impoverished art can do something. It can join people together in a new way, and with its force, it might usher in some kind of new order, or at least it might take up arms against the world order as it is arranged. I also think this global view, well, it's not quite a global view, can help us a bit. One of the thoughts that is deep behind this lecture is that impoverishment is a term that can be considered in opposition to abstraction. If you read histories of art, you'll find lots of talk about the historical course of modern art being a path of abstraction, so that colours, lines and forms are abstracted from real life to create new modes of artistic construction. One of the hallmarks of abstraction is that it's elevating, insofar as it always seems to privilege the work of the mind that does the abstraction. What is important is not so much the line as it first presented itself in reality, nor the line as it is made autonomous from that reality, but rather the force of the thought that ripped it from that reality and constructed it into some new work that is independent of reality. Now, the history of modern art as abstraction has been promoted most notably by American elites. The term abstract art first crops up in the 1930s in Europe, but the promotion of it as an explanation of the historical course of modern art is very distinctly American. My sense is that abstraction isn't the whole story, and that lots of artists considered to have worked in abstract modes have in fact been asking a different question. Not how can I use my mind to make the world into an idea, but how can I make an impoverished art in an impoverished world? The end point of this thought is never just an idea, but is a type of practical, if ephemeral and embattled, world building. The question has not been how can I draw a line out of life into the autonomous realm of art, but how can I degrade art to the point that the poverty of life appears in it. And I want you to see that this process of impoverishment, of simplification that happens under the name of impoverishment, often looks a lot like abstraction. What's important also is that we find in these art rats, in the impoverished art, a distinctive kind of avant-garde that is anti-American, and this is particularly prominent in the 20th century. You can see it in Italy and in Guatemala, in a world composed of guerrilla fighters fighting off American imperialism. The art of poverty is forged as a weapon in that war. And lots of this is lost if you accept the American explanation. So, where is the poor art now? And does it persist? And if it does persist, why does it persist? I don't really have any answers to this, but I do think it persists. And to close, I want to mention a small argument in art theory that's taken place really recently in this realm. About a decade ago, an artist called Hito Steyerl put out an essay called In Defense of the Poor Image. Steyerl, who is a professor at the art school in Berlin, was one of a group of artists who at the time was associated with the term post-internet. I'm not certain if she ever used this term herself, but in any case I will quote and you can get a little flavour of her ideas. She says this: "The poor image is a rag or a rip, an AVI or a JPEG, a lumpen proletariat in the class society of appearances, ranked and valued according to its resolution. The poor image has been uploaded, downloaded, shared, reformatted and re-edited. Poor images are the contemporary wretched of the screen, the debris of audiovisual production, the trash that washes up on the digital economy's shores. They testify to the violent dislocation, transferals and displacements of images, their acceleration and circulation within the vicious cycles of audiovisual capitalism. Poor images are dragged around the globe as commodities or their effigies, as gifts or as bounty. They spread pleasure or death threats, conspiracy theories or bootlegs, resistance or stultification. Poor images show the rare, the obvious and the unbelievable, that is, if we can still manage to decipher it." This sort of art doesn't exist quite as much as the way it did a decade ago, when there was a lot of glitch art, a lot of floating GIFs over pastel-coloured backgrounds. But you'll see similar trends in art based on memes today. And you see here that Steyerl sees a degraded imagery that circulates on the internet, hyper-compressed, screenshotted, corrupted, and so on, as the grounds for a new impoverished art. You'll see that she quietly invokes Fanon too, the wretched of the screen and not the wretched of the earth. And that there's some kind of reference to the anti-imperialist warfare of the 1960s. There's a rather cutting response to her thought in a book about poetry that came out a couple of years ago by a writer called Danny Hayward. This is what he says: "There's no such thing as a poor image. There are images by rich artists trying to conceal their wealth, and there are images by poor ones trying to become individually or collectively wealthy. The transferal of epithets of social class to forms of representation is always a sign we are dealing with a surrogate immediacy and various effects that obfuscate its real basis in class bias and social resentment. Good artists need to be able to express that knowledge in their art." Now, that's not such an easy paragraph to read, so I'll unpack it a little. The thrust of the accusation here is that Steyerl is making some kind of mistake by imagining images to be rich or poor, when in fact these are words that should mostly apply to people and to real life. And more than this, she uses the term poor for certain types of digital images because she is refusing to engage with the poverty of real people. At worst, the production of the poor image might be a disguise. Maybe I can put this another way. Because Steyerl conceives of the world as already entirely composed of images, something is missing. If the impoverished arts have always tried to offer a bridge between art and life, then within Steyerl's thought there really is no sphere of life to which a bridge might lead. The world is already all art, all technique, and it is filled with self-generating trash. I think in the face of this sort of vision, Danny Hayward is kind of right to assert the reality of life. However, he's a little down on something like an aesthetic project of impoverishment. He doesn't accept the proposition that there may be a collective of artists who do not seek to become richer, but who, in the face of the coming catastrophe, seek a sort of collective cultural impoverishment as, if not a solution, at least a strategy. He's certainly correct to suspect the image of poverty as sometimes being a thin cover too. But it's also the case, if you read his really excellent book, that he is actually one of the great thinkers of rats in art. He has this whole book dedicated to the poetic rats of our time. But he raises a question about whether contemporary modes of artistic impoverishment really can undo that division of art and life in the way that they seem to promise. And he ends up sceptical. The truth is that maybe the art rats never did succeed or make good on their promise. Art is not life, and life is not art, even if there are rats everywhere, or at least everywhere underground. So it's no surprise to find someone working on contemporary rats who says, look, this doesn't work. There is no reconciling art and life in this way, because at the end of it, someone makes something that looks like a rat, but actually isn't a rat, and at great cost sells it to you as if it were the live rat that you need. So, we've got to the end of our history of rats, or our unhistory of rats, because rats don't really have a history. I would like to close this lecture by making a plea. You're artists, and I want to appeal to this crude thinking, and to this idea of live rats. I encourage you to ask the question, how do I impoverish my art? How could I make a live rat, if a live rat is the sort of thing that can be made, and isn't always there already, just waiting to be uncovered? And what are the strategies of impoverishment that we can use now? Do we need moral impoverishment, technological impoverishment, impoverishment of modes of communication? And impoverishment, it turns out, is really hard. It's a really hard thought that you have to pursue ferociously. I came here to tell you about a rat, and I ended up giving you a lecture for an hour. I have failed in my attempt to impoverish my own thought. I came to tell you about something with no history, a figure that was constantly pushing back at history for the sake of the life of contemporary relevance, and all I've been able to do is tell you of its history. But I've told you about this rat over and over and over again, and that's as close to an impoverished lecture as I can give, and I can encourage you to pursue this. It's a thought that can help us to avoid our art sinking into the terrible wealth of the world. And to close, I'd just like to end with one last quote from Walter Benjamin, again, when he's thinking about Brecht. He says, "They understand how to pose a subtle and sophisticated question." And when he says they, he means the rich, the aristocracy, the bourgeoisie, the warmongers, the factory owners, the bosses, all of the wealthy people. They understand how to pose some of the sophisticated questions. But they swamped the sewers of their questions with the tidal sludge of their answers, their unfiltered wealth, which is beneficial for a few and detrimental to almost everyone. We, the poor, on the other hand, pose down-to-earth questions, but we let the answers through only if they have been screened 3 times over. That's all I have to say. Go forth and make rats.